Welcome to this video. This is the first video in my series of videos that I plan to make on Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica. In this series of videos, I intend to just go through some of the details of Principia Mathematica. I'm hoping to condense the work down to a certain extent to a more manageable size and make it hopefully a bit more accessible to a wider audience. There are 3 volumes in total to Principia Mathematica, covering a total of about 1,900 pages. So you can appreciate that it requires a lot of energy and concentration, a lot of effort, and it's very time consuming to go through Principia Mathematica in its entirety. As of recording this video, I haven't actually gone through all 3 volumes fully yet. But what I have gone through, the parts that I have gone through, which is most of practically all of the first volume so far, has been very time consuming to go through. So I'm going to say right from the outset 2 things. First of all, I'm not going to be going through line by line and proposition by proposition the contents of Principia Mathematica. It'd take literally thousands of hours for me to do that, and it's completely unnecessary to do so. Second of all, I can't guarantee that I will actually, that this series of videos will cover all 3 volumes of Principia Mathematica. I might feel that after a certain point that I've discussed enough and that I want to move on to something else. It really depends how long the series ends up being. There are going to be some aspects that I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail with. So these are the aspects of Principia Mathematica that are maybe a bit more critical to the understanding of the work. On the other hand, there are going to be some aspects that are less necessary, less critical to the understanding of Principia Mathematica, and these I might give less explanation, a shorter explanation. I might even skip over some aspects completely, or just mention them kind of in passing, rather than going into great detail with them. This video, which is the first video in this series, is really just to give a bit of an idea about what kind of things to expect and what not to expect from the series of videos. Also to give a bit of background information, a bit of historical waffle about Principia Mathematica and its authors. But in this video, I'm not planning on actually making a start on the content of Principia Mathematica itself. I will be doing that in the next video, so if you are keen to get started on the actual content of Principia Mathematica, the next video in the series will be uploaded at roughly the same time as this video, so you should be able to get started on that more or less straight away. So I'm not aiming in these videos to give some kind of deep philosophical critique of Principia Mathematica. I'm not going to be trying to update the contents of Principia Mathematica and reformulate its contents in more modern notation or more modern terminology. I'm not going to be trying to take the content beyond where it finishes off in the 3rd volume. None of these things. All I really want to do is to just simply present a highly influential and historically important mathematical work in a way that makes it accessible to a wider range of people. I will make some brief comments from time to time, here and there, if I think it's relevant and interesting, useful to do so. These comments might be on technical aspects, they might be certain observations that I've made, they might be observations that other philosophers, mathematicians and logicians have made since the writing of Principia Mathematica, but largely I'm going to be taking the contents of Principia Mathematica as they are and letting the contents speak for themselves, really. Nor am I trying to make some kind of effort to resurrect logicism as a philosophy of mathematics. So logicism is the school of thought with which Russell is most closely associated. Maybe considered the main player, the main actor in this particular school of thought, but I'm not making any naive attempts to try to resurrect logicism as a school of thought in mathematics. I'm not even sure that would be possible nowadays. The version of Principia Mathematica that I'm going to be referring to in these videos is the 1st edition, which was published between 1910 and 1913. There is a second edition which was published some decade or a couple of decades later after the first edition, and which differs from the first edition in certain regards. So by the time the second edition was being published, Russell and Whitehead, the authors of Principia Mathematica, had maybe changed their minds about some of the certainly philosophical aspects of the first edition, and made a separate introduction and comment to the second edition, and commented on some of those things that they changed their minds about. So be aware that as I go through these videos, I will be referring to the first edition, and there may be some conflict therefore between what I say and what is contained in, for example, the second edition of Principia Mathematica, if that is an edition that you happen to be referring to. Ultimately, it won't really make too much difference whether you refer to the first or second edition, but just be aware that there are some differences. I might, at a later date, make a couple of videos just talking about some of the main differences between the two. I've got no real plans to do that just yet, but that might be something that I decide to do further down the line. It would certainly help if you do have a copy of Principia Mathematica available to you, whether it's a hard copy or a digital copy. I don't know exactly what the law is regarding works such as this entering the public domain, whether Principia Mathematica is in the public domain. I really don't know. It may or may not be possible for you to download, to legally download a digital copy of Principia Mathematica off the internet, but obviously if you decide to do that, then it goes without saying that you need to make sure that the copy that you're downloading is a legal copy. I'm certainly not going to encourage any illegal downloading in this video, or in any other video that I make for that matter. So I'm not going to be giving a full comprehensive treatment of Principia Mathematica. What I really aim to do in these videos is to pick out the details that I found most difficult to get my head around personally, elaborate on some of those points, and hopefully make the work, maybe make some things easier for other people to understand. Maybe if they have the same problems, maybe I answer some of their questions and make the work easier to understand for other people as well. However, I can't guarantee that I fully understood everything in Principia Mathematica. The work is 1,900 pages long. Its sheer length practically guarantees that there will be certain things that I've overlooked, maybe things that I've misunderstood along the way. The pages of Principia Mathematica can sometimes be absolutely jam-packed with information and nuance, and some of these nuances can take quite some time to really resolve them, to really become apparent, and for certain issues to resolve themselves in your own mind. So some of those things are still working through my own mind now, and there have been certain things that have taken me several weeks, maybe even a couple of months, for me to fully feel comfortable with, and they're the things that I want to try to explain in these videos. But as a mathematician first and foremost, and not a scholar of philosophy, a scholar of history of mathematics or anything like that, I can't guarantee 100% accuracy in what I say, particularly in the philosophical aspects of Principia Mathematica. There is a very strong philosophical component to Principia Mathematica, though not as much of a philosophical component as there would be in some of Bertrand Russell's other works. But because there is that philosophical aspect there, it means that the work is very open to interpretation and very open to disagreement as well. So even at the time that Principia Mathematica was written, it couldn't be taken for granted that it would be universally or even widely accepted. At the time, there were different schools of thought following different philosophies within mathematics. Logicism, which is the school of thought with which Bertrand Russell is most closely associated, was just one of those schools of thought, all competing against each other for supremacy, effectively. So the contents of Principia Mathematica at the time, certain aspects would have been strongly refuted by followers of the maybe formalist school of thought, or the intuitionist school of thought, and maybe even other philosophical schools of thought that maybe didn't have the same level of prominence as these ones, but still existed. So you've always got to bear this in mind as you go through Principia Mathematica, that it may be possible to interpret certain things in different ways. And this can be a bit of a shock for mathematicians, modern mathematicians. Certainly it was a bit of a shock when I came to reading, when I first got into philosophy of mathematics, discovering that things are not quite so clear cut as you might have originally hoped or expected. It's maybe not so much of a problem nowadays amongst mathematical circles. There tends to be a fairly uniform agreement in most of the major aspects of mathematics amongst mathematicians nowadays, but that certainly wasn't always the case. And that's got to be borne in mind when you come to read this, that there might be some things that definitely conflict with your modern perspective of mathematics. I would recommend that to get the most out of Principia Mathematica, that you approach it with an open mind, rather than going into it with a certain fixed personal philosophy that you're unwilling to change, and that you're just looking to pick fault and refute everything everywhere. That you actually go into it with an open mind and accept the possibility that there might be something there that might cause you to rethink some of your personal philosophy. It's very easy, I think, for modern mathematicians to forget about the philosophical aspects of what goes on behind the symbols that they shuffle around on the page. It's very easy for modern mathematicians to just see the symbols on the page as meaningless things, effectively, that they're just kind of shuffling around on the page. And that's not me trying to take a dig or a stab at mathematicians. Mathematicians do what they do. They're not necessarily interested in the philosophical aspects, and it's not necessarily relevant to what they do. So I'm certainly not trying to have a dig at mathematicians, but speaking from the perspective of somebody who is first and foremost a mathematician, I know that it can be very easy to just get into the habit of shuffling things around on the page without really thinking too much about the philosophical aspects that go into making it possible for you to make those transformations. And this is going to be really important, actually, when it comes to some aspects of Principia Mathematica. There are certain aspects, particularly when it comes to things like axiom of reducibility, theory of types, descriptions in Principia Mathematica. If you see them as purely symbols on a page and you're just shuffling them around and they're kind of meaningless, but you're just shuffling them around according to some miscellaneous rules, then what you'll find probably very quickly is that those symbols stop making any sense whatsoever to you. What you really need is, there's a bit of philosophy that's going on in the background that's actually really relevant to effective manipulation of those symbols, which is something that's usually quite absent in modern mathematics. Again, I'm not taking a stab at mathematics or mathematicians, but it is something that's very different between the contents of Principia Mathematica and modern mathematics, that there is that philosophical aspect there. So it might help as well to have some kind of basic understanding of Russell's logical atomism, his philosophical perspective on things, might help to understand things a little bit better as you go through. You don't necessarily need to know all his philosophy in all its gory detail, because it did change quite a lot over his life. His philosophy did change, personal philosophy did change and had to be updated from time to time. But having a basic understanding of some of the main points of his philosophy, certainly around the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, could be a massive advantage. Not necessarily absolutely essential, but could be an advantage. Also, on a final, not final point, actually, there's more that I want to say, but just to say, there are a lot of concepts and ideas in Principia Mathematica that are very unfamiliar to modern mathematicians. I've already mentioned descriptions, which are something that are going to be very different to what a modern mathematician would be used to. It also might be that some of the ideas that are introduced do kind of correspond to modern day notions, but are used in very different ways. So things like classes, which correspond maybe to the more modern notion of set, are treated in a very, very different way. That's not to say that the modern conception of set is completely irrelevant when it comes to interpreting classes, but there is a very big difference between the two, and again the philosophy comes into things when it comes to interpreting classes and how we're supposed to interpret classes and things like that. I will be using the terminology and notation of Principia Mathematica throughout this series. I'm not going to be trying to reformulate things, as I've already said, in more modern notation or terminology. I'm just going to be letting the contents of Principia Mathematica speak for themselves, really. In my opinion, Principia Mathematica is best read purely as a historical document, a historical curiosity, or as part of some historical research if you're doing that. Reading Principia Mathematica may give you a better understanding of the history of mathematics, so you might become a better historian of mathematics. You might get a better understanding of the philosophy of mathematics, but you will not become a better mathematician. No mathematician, no modern mathematician that would be looking to get published in a mathematical journal, for instance, would, in my opinion, even consider the possibility of using the ideas in Principia Mathematica to do that. I could even go so far as to say that Principia Mathematica is completely, totally, and utterly irrelevant to modern day mathematics. And if you are looking to become a better mathematician, don't look towards Principia Mathematica to help you do that. Look towards some more contemporary textbooks or works on mathematics to help you with that. Please be aware that some of the sections of Principia Mathematica that I'm going to be going through, I'm going to be going into some quite considerable detail with some of these aspects. And it might be that sometimes, even though I try to explain things as clearly as possible and in as much detail as I can, it will still take some time for some of the ideas, some of the concepts to sink in. And it is important to let some of these ideas sink in because some of them are absolutely critical to the understanding of Principia Mathematica. So things like classes, things like descriptions, descriptive functions, axiom of reducibility, these are all critical really to the understanding of Principia Mathematica, and they're not necessarily easy things to understand. So it might be that even as you watch through the videos, that you might need to take your own notes, you might need to watch or rewatch certain parts of explanations that I give. Don't think that watching the videos in a purely passive way will work. The videos that I'm going to be making relating to this series of videos are not really intended to be watched in a purely passive way. If you do watch them in a purely passive way, then what you get out of the videos will be extremely limited. You will need to spend some time thinking about these concepts and trying to assimilate the concepts and ideas if you really want to understand Principia Mathematica. And if you don't really want to take the time to do those things, then maybe it would be better to read something other than Principia Mathematica. Just regarding the introduction to Principia Mathematica, again referring to the first edition, there is quite a lengthy introduction. It's made up of 3 separate parts, and it goes on for about 90 or so pages. So the introduction is it is a gold mine of information, but the information will only make sense at certain points. So what I suggest is certainly have a quick read through some of the some or maybe all of the introduction, just to get an idea of what kind of things are there, but be aware that a lot of the stuff that's in the introduction won't make sense until you've actually got through a certain amount of the work in the main body of the work of Principia Mathematica, at which point you'll need to come back to the introduction to get a more full explanation of some of the concepts and ideas, because even though let's say we take the chapter on axiom of reducibility, there's a very full explanation given about the axiom of reducibility, reasons for accepting it and how it comes about and things like that, the rationale behind it. There are still some things that can be clarified, made a bit more clear by reading. There's a section in the introduction on the axiom of reducibility and its relevance and things like that, and technical aspects that can, if you read both parts, then they can really complement each other quite well. If you read the part on axiom of reducibility in the introduction before you've actually got to the chapter on axiom of reducibility, it's probably not going to make a great deal of sense to you. So it is worth just having a flick through the introduction to see what kind of stuff is there, but then as you work through Principia Mathematica, being prepared to actually go back to the introduction, to certain parts of the introduction, just to get maybe a more clear understanding of some of the things that the main body of the work doesn't fully explain, or doesn't necessarily explain as well as it does in the introduction, oddly enough. Okay, so for the end of this video, I'm just going to touch on some of the maybe historical aspects of Principia Mathematica, and just touch on some of the main ideas that are contained in Principia Mathematica, just to give a bit of an idea about where things are going to be going. So Principia Mathematica is a 3-volume work written by Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell around the start of the 20th century. And Principia Mathematica was originally intended to just be a second volume to Bertrand Russell's earlier work, Principles of Mathematics, which was published around 1902, 1903, I can't remember exactly. But as the scope of the work grew, it became clear that it would have to be just a completely separate project in its own right, which resulted in the 3-volume, 1,900-page monstrosity that we have nowadays. What was the main aim of Principia Mathematica? Well, it was, and the main aim was to try to reduce as much of classical mathematics, at least mathematics as it stood at the beginning of the 20th century, to purely logical principles, so that we could start with a few logical principles, and from those few purely, indubitably logical principles, we could derive all, ideally, or at least as much of classical mathematics as was possible. Now, over the century or so since Principia Mathematica has been written, it's more than a century now actually, it's been shown that this goal was far too ambitious. Yes, mathematics can be reduced to a logical form to a certain extent, but not completely. There seems to be a certain aspect of mathematics that is not purely logical. So we can't just consider mathematics as a branch of logic, which is how Bertrand Russell originally hoped it would turn out, that logic was somehow prior to mathematics, mathematics presupposed logic, but it turns out that there is a certain component to mathematics that logic can't quite capture. Just regarding Bertrand Russell's early work, Principles of Mathematics, which is not to be confused with Principia Mathematica, it is a separate work. It can be worth reading Principles of Mathematics. It's more philosophical in nature than Principia Mathematica, but it does clarify some of Bertrand Russell's ideas. It goes into a little bit more detail in some things, but also it does create a bit of confusion here and there, particularly where it conflicts with Principia Mathematica, because between the years of Principles of Mathematics and Principia Mathematica being published, there was quite some considerable developments, and certain things in principles of mathematics became obsolete or redundant. But overall, if you want to get a good feel for Russell's philosophy around the time, his philosophy of mathematics, then Principles of Mathematics is a good book to read. It's quite dense, it's quite long, it's about 550 or so pages long. It's not absolutely essential to read it before Principia Mathematica or anything like that, but it could be useful to do so. So where did this idea of logicizing mathematics come from? It wasn't a completely original idea of Russell's to do this. It was something that actually it seized upon through the works of Frege and Peano towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. They were amongst the first mathematicians and philosophers to try to reduce at least portions of mathematics to a symbolic logical form with varying degrees of success. And it was Bertrand Russell that decided that this actually could be extended to the whole of mathematics, not just certain parts of mathematics, but to mathematics as a whole. So he spent several years trying to refine this this idea, and eventually when we ended up with Principia Mathematica. The ultimate goal of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead was to not only logicize mathematics, but to logicize all of human knowledge. So mathematics was seen by Russell as a kind of paradigm of human knowledge, and he felt that if he could logicize mathematics, then that would give a clear indication that all of human knowledge could actually be logicized as well. So this was a huge project. Principia Mathematica was a huge project in its own right, but the ultimate goal was such a huge project that it's unbelievable the scale of the project that they were actually aiming for. Ultimately, though, Principia Mathematica was almost a total failure in many respects. The idea of logicizing entirely mathematics, it became clear eventually that this just wasn't possible, and the system in Principia Mathematica kind of fell out of use fairly quickly and replaced by more efficient systems, because the feel that you get as you read through Principia Mathematica is that it's kind of quite ad hoc. There are certain issues that come up every now and again, and Bertrand Russell will and Whitehead will come up with a solution to it, but it seems a very ad hoc solution, and then further down the line something else kind of comes up and they come up with another ad hoc solution to it. It seems to be less definite in a way than maybe a later system might work. It has a very ad hoc feel to it, a very random feel once you start to really get into it. But nonetheless, it is a very significant and influential work, and it did a lot to at least logicize huge chunks of mathematics. So now it is possible to reduce a lot of mathematics to purely logical terms, but we've still got this part of mathematics that ultimately can't be reduced to purely logical terms. I just want to take a couple of minutes to do a little bit of debunking at this stage. Anybody that's read a few popular maths books, so books that are written on kind of mathematical theories that are presented in a way for non-mathematicans, for the lay person to understand, will almost certainly have heard of Principia Mathematica, even without necessarily knowing what it is. Because I'm not going to mention any specific titles of books or anything like that, but often you get something like Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell wrote Principia Mathematica and took 800 or so pages to prove that 1 plus 1 equals 2, blah, 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 blah. And then you're given a kind of an excerpt from Principia Mathematica, which is the symbols, the proof of 1 plus 1 equals 2, which nobody understands. And it kind of gives the impression that Principia Mathematica was just some eccentric mathematician's obsession with proving that 1 plus 1 equals 2. I know, certainly I would agree that mathematicians can be very strange people, and they do have some strange obsessions, but it certainly wasn't an obsession of Russell and Whitehead, as far as I can see, that they wanted to prove that 1 plus 1 equals 2. The scope of the project of Principia Mathematica was so much grander than proving that 1 plus 1 equals 2. Certainly the proof of 1 plus 1 equals 2 is there in Principia Mathematica, but it's nothing more than a couple of lines, basically. If that was the main goal of Principia Mathematica, Russell and Whitehead would have been able to do that in a much shorter space. And that's because that wasn't the main goal. The reason that it took so long, basically, is because it wasn't the main goal. It was just something that happened along the way. There came a certain time where it was relevant, it seemed relevant or convenient to prove that 1 plus 1 equals 2. Also, there is a little, it's often taken as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of comment by Russell and Whitehead following the proof of 1 plus 1 equals 2, which says something like, this proposition is frequently useful. And okay, it may be some kind of little joke referring to 1 plus 1 equals 2 being frequently useful. But actually, I don't necessarily interpret it like that, because very often through Principia Mathematica, there's comments sprinkled here and there saying that such and such a proposition is going to be frequently useful or infrequently useful, or it's going to be used this number of times in this proposition, that proposition, and the other proposition. And this is no different, really. It says something along the lines of this proposition is frequently useful. It is used at least 3 times in such and such a proposition, this, that, and the other. So it's kind of in line with the comments that exist elsewhere in Principia Mathematica. And I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that it's meant as some kind of tongue-in-cheek joke that 1 plus 1 is equal to 2 is frequently useful. Obviously, I don't take it like that, and that's not me just trying to spoil a good joke or something like that necessarily, but I just don't read it in the same way. So that's my bit of debunking gone. Also, something else that's a little bit, I don't know how correct this is, but usually when Principia Mathematica is mentioned, it's either attributed to Russell and Whitehead, or even sometimes what's worse is it's just attributed to Russell, Bertrand Russell's Principia Mathematica. So I just want to be clear that the order of the authors on the cover of the book is Alfred North Whitehead and then Bertrand Russell. So I don't know if this means that Whitehead had more input, because clearly they're not written in they're not alphabetical order there. So I don't know if it means that Whitehead had more input into writing Principia Mathematica and Bertrand Russell had a secondary role. But having said that, Bertrand Russell did write in an article in 1948 in the philosophical journal Mind that the contents of Principia Mathematica were fairly evenly spread. And even though the certain chapters were assigned to one or the other to focus on to write, it would always have been checked by the other author and verified and everything. So I don't know how much there is to read into the order of the authors, but I try to refer to it as Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica to take into consideration the order of the authors on the front cover. So I've already touched on one of the main ideas of Principia Mathematica. One of the main goals is to logicize classical mathematics as much as possible, so as great an extent as is possible. But the other main idea and the main theme of Principia Mathematica is to develop the doctrine of the theory of types. So the theory of types is Russell's solution to what he refers to as the paradoxes of the vicious circle type. So these kinds of paradoxes came around or became very relevant during his writing of Principles of Mathematics. So just as he was finishing up on his Principles of Mathematics, and he thought he'd basically succeeded in logicizing all of mathematics in principle, it became apparent that there was a bit of a problem. And the problem came about when he started to consider classes, and in particular classes which are members of themselves, and also classes which are not members of themselves. So if we take, so this is the famous Russell's paradox, that if we take, it may be that some classes are members of themselves and some classes are not members of themselves. So now if we consider the class of all classes that are not members of themselves, is this class a member of itself or is it not a member of itself? Well, it turns out that if it is a member of itself, then it's not a member of itself. And if it's not a member of itself, then it is a member of itself. So in other words, we end up in this vicious circle, just going round and round and round. If the class is a member of itself, then it's not a member of itself, then it is a member of itself, blah, blah, etc., etc., etc. And this was a huge spanner in the works for Russell's Principles of Mathematics, because it nullified a lot of the stuff that he was saying in Principles of Mathematics. And it meant that he had to, whereas he was taking kind of unrestricted variables in Principles of Mathematics, he soon realized that he had to impose some kind of restriction on variables. And the solution to that was to restrict variables to what are called types. And in order to avoid these vicious circle paradoxes, this vicious circle principle, we can only allow into propositional functions arguments of certain types. So the variable can range over a class that contains members of a particular type. The variable can range over that particular set of values or collection of values, but it cannot jump to a different type. Okay, so this guarantees to a certain extent that we can't get these vicious circle paradoxes coming up, because what it forbids is it forbids a propositional function being its own arguments, being amongst its own arguments. And this means that therefore a class cannot be, because we will ultimately be defining classes in terms of the extension of a propositional function. It means that effectively a class cannot be a member of itself. That a class is of a different type to its members, so therefore the class cannot be one amongst its members. And this is one of the main theories, the main doctrines that is developed in Principia Mathematica. Principia Mathematica has been criticized because it is quite a cumbersome solution to this vicious circle paradox, to Russell's paradox. But it was an initial attempt to overcome the problems of these vicious circle paradoxes. It was a solid attempt, but ultimately it failed. And it was the realization of this paradox, Russell's paradox as it's called now, that ultimately caused Frege to give up on his life's work. So Frege thought that he also had managed to in principle, reduced a lot of mathematics to logic until Russell pointed out this problem within his logical system. It affected not only Russell's system, but Frege's system as well. And Frege couldn't find a solution to it, and he died a couple of decades later, thinking that his life's work was a complete failure. Turns out that his life's work wasn't a complete failure. It just didn't have the impact in the way that he thought that it would. It has had a lot of impact, his work, but just not in the way that he expected that it would have been. So this is one of the things that we will see a lot of in Principia Mathematica, this theory of types. It's going to take quite a while for it to explain. I've only given a basic kind of idea here. So if it's not fully clear what the theory of types is, just from what I've said here, then that's normal, really. I wouldn't really expect it to be fully 100% clarified, but just to give you a bit of an idea about where things are going. So I think I'm going to finish up with this video there. In the next video, I'm actually going to make a start on the content of Principia Mathematica. I don't know how long the next video is going to be. There is quite a lot to get through initially, just to get things up and running, basically. Primitive ideas and primitive propositions. But I'm going to finish up there with this video. So I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.